I never imagined Grandpa's funeral would feel more like a board meeting than a farewell. The church in Portland smelled overwhelmingly of lilies, so strong it almost made my eyes water. The organ played softly, a hymn I recognized but couldn't fully hum along with because my mind was elsewhere. People whispered in clusters, adjusting their black coats, checking their watches. No one looked at me directly. When I stepped inside, I paused in the vestibule, taking in the scene. The front pews were filled. My parents, Alara and my father beside her, sitting stiff as though carved out of stone. My sister Zinnia sat primly next to them, her heels crossed, a silk scarf draped like she was walking a runway instead of mourning. I glanced down at the program and my stomach sank. My name wasn't listed under grandchildren. A strange omission, considering there weren't that many of us. A young usher approached, polite smile plastered on his face. He handed me a small paper tag. "Family guest," it read in neat, bold letters. I blinked at it, then at him. "Why does it say guest?" I asked quietly. He shrugged, clearly uncomfortable. "That's what they gave me." I looked toward my family at the front pews. None of them turned. I could feel Zinnia's eyes on me, though, and when she caught me looking, she tilted her head and smirked. "Maybe it's a sign," she mouthed across the aisle. Heat crept up my neck, but I didn't answer. Instead, I pinned the tag to my jacket and made my way to a bench near the back, my footsteps echoing. Even here, I thought, I was invisible. The service began, the priest speaking about Grandpa's long life, his dedication to family, his unwavering commitment to the community. His words were meant to comfort, but each one landed like a quiet accusation. He praised the devotion of his children, the loyalty of his grandchildren. Not once did he say my name. I sat frozen, hands folded tightly in my lap. When Zinnia rose to speak, her heels clicking dramatically, the congregation leaned forward as if she were some celebrity. "Grandpa was always closest to me," she began, voice strong. "He confided in me, trusted me, leaned on me. I was there for him." She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, perfectly timed. The crowd murmured with sympathy. I looked down, biting the inside of my cheek. They didn't know. None of them knew about the late nights I spent at his bedside, bringing him soup, reading aloud from his favorite novels when his eyesight failed. None of them knew the quiet moments in his study when he told me stories about his youth, how he reminded me that silence can be more powerful than shouting. One memory surfaced sharply. Grandpa, leaning back in his leather chair, looking at me with tired but clear eyes. "You listen better than anyone, Narina," he'd said. "That's your strength. Don't let them tell you otherwise." I held on to those words now, like a lifeline, while Zinnia spun her narrative at the pulpit. The stained glass windows cast beams of colored light through the sanctuary. One strip of golden light landed right across my lap, even as the front pew remained in shadow. It felt almost symbolic, though I kept that thought to myself. After the final hymn, we moved to the casket viewing. Relatives lined up with roses, moving slowly in somber order. I stood near the back, waiting. Every time I took a step forward, someone seemed to cut ahead. My turn came last. As I reached the casket, whispers floated behind me. She barely came around. Did she even know him well? The sting was sharp, but I pressed my hand to the cool wood and leaned closer. "I came more than they ever knew," I whispered under my breath. No one heard it but me, and perhaps him. When I turned, my parents looked away. My mother busied herself smoothing her dress, my father focused on his shoes. Zinnia was already on her phone, murmuring about dinner plans, laughter slipping out as if the day was nothing more than a social gathering. Walking out into the crisp Portland rain, I pulled my coat tighter. Drops pelted the sidewalk, soaking my shoes. It wasn't just that they ignored me. It wasn't just that they erased me. They were rewriting me, turning me into someone who didn't care, someone absent. But I knew the truth, and so did Grandpa. As I stood on the steps of the church, I realized this wasn't just a farewell. It was the opening act of a war they didn't see coming. The church service ended with a low murmur that carried us all toward the reception hall. I followed the stream of black coats and quiet chatter, the weight of the earlier humiliation still pressing against my chest. The hall smelled of coffee and sugar cookies, a contrast to the heaviness of incense and lilies in the sanctuary. Folding chairs scraped against the floor as people gathered around tables, balancing paper plates filled with pastries. At first glance, it looked like any post-funeral gathering. Cousins reminiscing, neighbors offering condolences, old friends remembering Grandpa's jokes. But then my eyes landed on the large memorial board set up near the piano. It displayed photos of Grandpa's life, milestones written underneath, and a list of all family members. My stomach tightened as I stepped closer. I scanned the list once, then again. My name wasn't there. "Strange, isn't it?" my cousin Lydia said, standing beside me with a cup of coffee in her hand. She squinted at the board, her expression half amusement, half discomfort. "Your name's missing." I tried to steady my voice. "Looks like it." Before I could ask anything more, my mother walked over, smoothing her black dress with deliberate calm. "Must have been a printing error," she said flatly. "Don't overthink it, Narina." Then, without another glance, she turned to greet a family friend. A printing error. That was her explanation. I stared at the neat columns of names, siblings, cousins, even spouses of distant relatives, but not me. In that moment, I remembered something I once read. The palest ink is better than the best memory. If ink can preserve existence, then its absence can erase it. And here I was, standing erased in plain sight. The sound of clinking cups pulled me back, and before long, an announcement was made for a group photo. The photographer, an older man with a polite smile, gestured everyone toward the front of the hall. "Let's have the family together," he called out, arranging chairs, asking taller people to stand in the back. I moved instinctively toward the center, but Zinnia slid beside me, her hand brushing my arm just enough to push me slightly to the side. She whispered sharply, her perfume heavy and deliberate. "Maybe stand with the cousins, not the immediate family. It'll look more natural." I froze, her words cutting deep even though they were quiet. People shuffled around, no one noticing, or maybe they noticed and chose not to intervene. Either way, I ended up off to the side, pressed against the wall as the main cluster formed. The camera flash went off. Click. In that official picture, the one destined to be framed and remembered, I wasn't truly there. Zinnia tilted her head back and laughed as if she'd just told a clever joke. A few cousins chuckled with her, either too nervous or too complicit to stop. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself not to react. Public confrontation here would only make me look bitter, the ungrateful outcast. Inside, though, something hardened. I realized the photo wasn't just about remembrance, it was about narrative, and in their story, I wasn't meant to be part of the core. I needed air. Stepping outside into the gray drizzle, I leaned against the brick wall of the church hall, pulling my coat tighter. The sound of footsteps on wet pavement drew my attention. Around the corner, muffled voices carried in the damp air. I recognized them instantly, my mother's low tone, followed by Zinnia's sharper pitch. I held my breath and listened. 51 million is more than enough for us, my mother said. She doesn't need to know about it. 51 million. The words dropped like stones into a still pond, rippling through me. She wouldn't know what to do with it anyway, Zinnia added, her voice dripping with contempt. Better that we handle it. My pulse quickened. I froze, torn between stepping out to confront them and staying hidden. The realization was like ice in my veins. They weren't just trying to erase me from photos and boards. They were hiding something monumental, something Grandpa left behind. Shock burned into clarity. I thought of Grandpa's words in his study, his insistence that patience was a weapon. He had told me to wait, to let people reveal themselves, and here they were, revealing everything. I stepped back silently, my shoes splashing in shallow puddles, careful not to be heard. Re-entering the hall, I grabbed a napkin just to have something in my hands, nodding absently to an old neighbor who greeted me. My thoughts were spinning, but outwardly, I remained calm. I left not long after, slipping out while the others still mingled. Rain fell harder now, soaking the pavement as I walked to my car. Drops rolled down the windshield when I sat inside, but I didn't start the engine right away. I needed to breathe, to piece together what had just unfolded. First, my name missing from the memorial board, then being pushed aside in the family photo. Now whispers of millions, 51 no less, spoken like a secret to be hoarded. When people erase you from small things, I thought bitterly, they're practicing for erasing you from bigger ones. I gripped the steering wheel, drenched in both rain and doubt, but clarity was forming like a blade. If they think I'll stay silent, I whispered to myself, they don't know me at all. I didn't change out of my black dress when I got home that night. The hem was damp from the Portland rain, and my shoes left little wet prints on the linoleum floor of my apartment, but I couldn't bring myself to move much. I dropped my coat over the back of a chair and went straight to the kitchen. The whispers I'd overheard, 51 million is more than enough for us, kept looping in my mind like a bad recording I couldn't shut off. I opened the fridge and pulled out a box of red wine, poured a generous glass, and sat at the counter. The cheap wine wasn't about taste, it was about comfort, the way many Americans reach for something simple when the weight of the day presses down. I stared at the liquid swirling in the glass, thinking about how easily my family rewrote stories. For years, they'd controlled how the world saw me, the unremarkable daughter, the one too quiet to matter. But what I heard tonight hinted at something far bigger, something they were determined to bury. I lifted the glass and murmured to myself, if there's one thing people in this country know, money always shows the truth in families. I thought of Grandpa, how he used to warn me that silence was both shield and sword. That night, with the rain tapping against the window and the taste of bitterness mixing with cheap wine, I made a promise. I would not let them erase me, not this time, not when something that enormous was hidden in the shadows. 2 weeks earlier, before the funeral, I had sat with Grandpa in his study. The memory came back as clear as if I'd walked into that oak-paneled room again. His desk was scattered with old books and yellowed notes, the smell of leather and paper lingering. Rain had tapped against the window then, too. He looked frail, his hands thin, but his eyes steady. "You know what they'll do, don't you?" he asked, his voice softer than I'd ever heard, but still deliberate. I shook my head. "What do you mean?" "They'll underestimate you," he said, leaning back in his chair. "That's your strength. Don't fight their games. Wait, watch. Let them believe they've already won." I frowned, unsure, but he smiled faintly. "You've always been the steady hand. Not like your sister chasing attention, or your mother chasing control. He tapped the desk for emphasis. "You endure. That's why I've made arrangements." "Arrangements?" I asked, my breath catching. He waved a hand, dismissing further questions. "You'll know when the time comes." I wanted to press, to make him explain, but the look in his eyes told me to trust him. He reached across the desk and patted my hand. "Family isn't blood, Narina. Family is who shows up when it matters." That memory echoed louder now. Maybe that was why they were trying so hard to push me aside. Maybe Grandpa had done something they couldn't control. The day after the funeral, I drove to my mother's house for what she called a small family gathering. When I arrived, the living room was full of relatives, some sitting with plates of food, others standing around admiring Grandpa's old things that had been laid out on tables. It looked less like mourning and more like an auction without bidding paddles. Alara pointed to the items, announcing who would take what. Zinnia wasted no time claiming a set of jewelry. "Grandpa always loved when I wore these," she said smugly, holding up the necklace. My mother nodded approvingly, handing her the case. Alara herself took the antique clocks that used to line the study, saying, "They'll remind me of the rhythm of his life." Two cousins argued over a painting, their voices rising until someone stepped in. When it came to me, Alara gestured to a chipped glass ashtray on the far table. "Here, Narina. You can take this." I stared at it. The ashtray wasn't even valuable. It was cracked on one side, the kind of thing you might find at a garage sale for 50 cents. Zinnia smirked from across the room. "Something small suits you, right?" A ripple of laughter followed from one or two relatives, though most stayed quiet. I felt the burn of humiliation rise in my throat, but I said nothing. I picked up the ashtray, holding it carefully as though it mattered. Inside, I was already cataloging every slight, every move. Someday, I'd need these memories. The gathering carried on with chatter, but I tuned most of it out. I left early, stepping into the cool evening with the ashtray wrapped in tissue. On the drive home, I kept glancing at it on the passenger seat, that ugly little object mocking me. The whispers of millions rang in my head alongside Zinnia's laughter. They gave me scraps because they were hiding a feast. People who offer you crumbs while feasting in secret are telling you something. They're terrified you'll find the table. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex, my humiliation had sharpened into resolve. I carried the ashtray upstairs, set it on the kitchen counter, and stared at it. "They think this is all I deserve," I whispered. "Let's see how they handle what Grandpa actually left me." The next evening, I drove to my mother's house in Lake Oswego. The streets were slick from an afternoon shower, the kind that leaves the air damp and heavy. When I stepped inside, the house already buzzed with conversation. The smell of roasted chicken and casseroles lingered, but underneath it was that same tension I'd grown used to. Relatives were scattered around the long dining table, balancing plates as though this was just another family dinner. But it wasn't. The table was arranged in a way that told its own story. At the head, Ilara presided, her posture rigid and proper. Zinnia sat close to her, glowing with self-importance as she recounted details of her latest work project. "Grandpa always told me he was proud of how I handled myself," she announced, voice just loud enough to carry across the table. A cousin clapped politely, and another aunt nodded. I sat far down at the other end, near the corner where the chairs didn't match. My plate felt heavier than it should, though I'd only served myself some green beans and mashed potatoes. Every word from Zinnia dripped with hypocrisy, because I knew the truth. Grandpa hadn't seen her half as much as she claimed. Yet here she was, building her story brick by brick, while the rest played along with nods and half smiles. I pushed food around my plate and listened. The tone of the evening was passive-aggressive, an orchestra of hidden barbs dressed as casual remarks. "Isn't it nice we can all be together like this?" Ilara said smoothly, not looking my way once. The implication wasn't lost on me. When the laughter at the other end peaked, I leaned back slightly. Inside, my thoughts ran sharp. They want me out of the frame socially before they can erase me legally. Zinnia leaned forward suddenly, her voice cutting across the chatter. "You know," she said loudly, eyes fixed on me, "some people should just be grateful we even let them sit here." The room went quiet for a second before uneasy laughter filled the space. Some cousins chuckled half-heartedly, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Ilara stayed silent, sipping her wine as though nothing had been said. Her silence was louder than words. My hand tightened around the fork. I wanted to stand, to slam it down, to ask how they dared. But I remembered Grandpa's voice. Patience is a weapon. Instead, I forced myself to take a slow breath. A cousin leaned toward me, whispering, "Just ignore her. It's not worth it." I glanced at him, forcing a smile. "It is worth it," I said softly. "Every word is fuel." I didn't eat much more. The food had turned tasteless. Later, I stood in the kitchen, helping to clear plates because no one else offered. The hum of voices drifted in from the dining room, punctuated by Zinnia's laugh. She followed me in, setting her glass down on the counter with a deliberate clink. "Don't worry," she said, her tone syrupy sweet. "Maybe you'll get something from Grandpa's things too, like his socks." Another sibling, standing by the fridge, chuckled. "That's probably all that's left for her?" Their laughter filled the small space. I gripped a dish towel, drying plates as though it were the most natural thing in the world. The sting was sharp, but I didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. I remembered Grandpa again, the way he looked at me with calm certainty. "They'll underestimate you. That's your edge." So I dried the dishes slowly, each plate a reminder that I wasn't there to fight in their arena. They saw a servant. I saw myself collecting evidence. Every insult was logged, every humiliation stored away. Zinnia leaned against the counter, watching me. "Quiet as always," she said. "It's almost too easy." I turned my head, met her eyes just long enough, and said nothing. Then I placed the last dish in the rack and walked past her without a word. My silence was deliberate, and she didn't even realize it. Back in the dining room, I sat at the end of the table again, speaking little. Guests began preparing to leave, voices rising in parting jokes and hugs. Ilara stood, clinking her glass. "Let's all thank Zinnia," she said warmly. She's been such a rock for this family. Applause rippled around the room. Not a word about me, not a glance in my direction. I sat still, watching her smile in triumph, Zinnia basking in the attention like a queen on her throne. Every humiliation is a down payment on my resolve, I thought. When the last of the relatives drifted toward the door, I rose, pulling my coat from the back of my chair. I stepped out into the cool night, the sky clear now after the rain. I paused at the edge of the driveway, looking back at the glowing windows where their laughter still spilled out. They think silence is surrender, I muttered. They'll find out soon it's strategy. Aunt Leora's living room smelled faintly of potpourri and lemon cleaner when I walked in that evening. The gathering was smaller than the funeral or the dinner at my mother's house, but the undercurrent was the same. Chatter, low laughter, eyes darting toward me as if I didn't belong. I kept my coat on longer than I should have, standing near the doorway until Leora insisted, "Come, sit down, Narina. Don't just hover." I chose a spot on the sofa's edge, but the conversation carried on as though I wasn't there. My cousins huddled in groups, sipping coffee, eating pound cake from paper plates. Their voices dropped when I approached, then rose again in laughter once I moved away. And then I caught it. Two aunts whispering near the kitchen doorway. "She's always been bad with money," one said, shaking her head. "Can't hold a job. Grandpa knew better than to trust her with anything important," the other replied, almost gleeful in her cruelty. The words landed sharp, but I didn't flinch. I took a slow sip of my coffee and let the bitterness sit on my tongue. They were rewriting me, reshaping who I was in front of others, financially irresponsible, unreliable, unworthy. They pretended history supported their story. I thought back to my years paying rent on time, balancing bills, working extra hours to cover what others wouldn't. No one in that room had seen me negotiate with landlords, fix broken appliances with my own two hands, or stretch a paycheck to cover groceries. None of that mattered to them. What mattered was controlling the narrative. I remembered a quote I once read, something Mark Twain had said. "A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes." Tonight, I could feel the lies sprinting while the truth waited, shoelaces tangled. I set my cup down with deliberate calm. Let them speak. Every whisper only confirmed what I already knew. They were afraid. And fear dressed itself in gossip. Later, when some of the cousins had left and the noise had settled, Alara approached me. She didn't call me across the room. Instead, she slipped to my side, her hand resting briefly on my arm, her smile careful. "Honey, could we talk in the other room?" I followed her into the living room, where the lamp's soft glow gave the illusion of warmth. She closed the door halfway and lowered her voice. "I know it's been stressful," she began, her tone dipped in concern. "All this back and forth, all this confusion. We don't want things to get more complicated than they already are." I tilted my head slightly, waiting. She reached into her purse and pulled out a sealed envelope. Holding it between two manicured fingers, she offered it to me. "Here's something for you. A gesture. It's fair, and it's yours. Please, don't stir up drama for the rest of us." I didn't take it right away. Instead, I asked, "What is it?" "Just open it," she urged. I slid the paper free and found a check inside. $5,000. I stared at it for a long moment, then looked back at her. "This is my share?" I asked. She nodded, relieved, as if the deal were already done. "Yes, that's right. Consider it your portion. It's more than enough, Narina." Across the room, I caught Zinnia watching us from behind the doorway, her smirk visible even in the dim light. Her eyes danced with triumph, as if she'd been waiting for this play all night. The humiliation hit me in waves. $5,000, handed like a bribe, like hush money to make me disappear. Not kindness, not fairness, a payoff. I folded the check slowly and slid it back into the envelope. My pulse was steady, my voice calm. "You can't buy silence with scraps, not mine." Alara's smile faltered, cracking at the edges. "Narina, don't be difficult. This is generous. We're trying to be fair." From the doorway, Zinnia scoffed. "Ungrateful, as always." I turned toward her, my voice firmer now. "You keep pretending this is generosity, but it isn't. It's fear. You're afraid of me. That's why you want me quiet." The words landed louder than I intended. Heads turned. A few relatives, lingering nearby, stopped their conversations to listen. The whisper of my defiance traveled through the room. Alara stiffened. "That's not true. You're overreacting." "No," I said. "I'm finally reacting." The silence stretched, uncomfortable, until Zinnia broke it with a sharp laugh. "You'll regret this, Narina." I met her gaze evenly. "I think you will." Without another word, I set the envelope on the table. It lay there under the chandelier's light, looking small, cheap, exposed. I walked out of the room, past the relatives whispering, past their narrowed eyes and muttered judgments. When I stepped outside, the Oregon night was cold, the air crisp against my face. I drew in a deep breath. The sting of insult still burned, but beneath it, something stronger had taken shape. Clarity. I pictured the envelope still sitting on that table under the glow of the chandelier. To them, it was an offer. To me, it was proof. A symbol of how little they thought of me and how terrified they were of the truth coming to light. "When they give you scraps," I whispered to myself, "it's because they're hiding a feast. I just need to prove it." Sliding into the driver's seat, I started the car. My reflection caught in the windshield, eyes sharper than I remembered. "If they think $5,000 is enough to shut me up," I muttered, voice steady, "wait until they see what 51 million looks like in my hands." 1 week after the funeral, I pulled into the driveway of my mother's house again. Cars lined the street, sedans, SUVs, a couple of luxury imports from cousins who always made sure people noticed what they drove. Through the windows, I could see silhouettes moving around, hear the faint hum of voices rising in small bursts of laughter. My chest tightened. After the bribe they tried to hand me at Leora's, I knew tonight would be no easier. The moment I stepped inside, the air felt different. The smell of casseroles and roast beef mingled with perfume and cologne, and the living room buzzed with people carrying plates, wine glasses in hand, talking over one another. Kids darted between legs, chasing each other with shrieks that grated against the thick undercurrent of tension. "Narina!" Zinnia called, her tone sweetened too much, like syrup poured on something already spoiled. She waved me over, but the way her eyes flickered told me she was drawing attention to me as though I were an unexpected guest. Conversations quieted just enough for people to glance in my direction, then resume with hushed undertones. I felt it, the way whispers followed me as I took off my coat and placed it on a chair. Cousins avoided eye contact. A couple of uncles nodded politely but quickly turned back to their drinks. Everyone was polite enough to cover the discomfort, but the distance was there, loud and deliberate. Later, as we gathered in clusters with plates in hand, I heard Alara's voice ring out above the noise. "We were all there for him, weren't we? Caring for him day and night." I froze, balancing my plate carefully. She wasn't talking to me directly, but her words cut through the air. "Especially us," Zinnia added, placing a hand dramatically over her chest. "Grandpa trusted us to handle everything. He leaned on us." A chorus of agreement followed. Heads nodded, affirmations of, "Yes, we did what we could," and "He knew we loved him." My throat tightened. I remembered the nights I sat by his hospital bed, reading aloud to him when he couldn't see the pages, holding his hand when he drifted to sleep, making sure he wasn't alone in those late hours when fear creeps deepest. None of them were there. They were rewriting history, placing themselves where I had stood, erasing me from even the last role I had with him, caregiver. I forced a small smile, pretending not to notice. My silence masked the sting, but inside it burned. Dinner was called soon after. Plates clattered, chairs moved, and everyone began to settle at the long main table. I waited, expecting a place, but as I approached, Alara glanced up. "Oh, Narina, there's no space here. Would you mind sitting with the kids?" The words landed heavy. A few children giggled, delighted that I was being relegated to their corner. I hesitated, scanning the table, and saw empty chairs that could have been pulled closer, but no one offered. "It's fitting, isn't it?" Zinnia's voice rang out across the room, loud enough for the whole table to hear. "She's always been a bit out of place." Laughter rippled through the adults, thin but cruel. I swallowed hard. walked quietly to the small folding table at the side of the room where the children sat. They looked at me with wide eyes, giggling again as I took the seat squeezed between a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old. I felt my face heat, humiliation pressing against my ribs, but I kept my head high. This isn't about a seat, I thought to myself as I unfolded my napkin. It's about power. The same way they've always tried to shrink me. The children chatted, dropping crumbs and spilling juice, unaware of the symbolism in this arrangement. I chewed slowly, every bite turning tasteless. Across the room, I could hear Zinnia holding court, laughter erupting at her quips, Alara nodding approvingly at every word. I said little, but my eyes stayed sharp. I noticed how Alara leaned toward Zinnia, whispering between bites, both of them glancing in my direction with smugness. Their game was clear. Erase me socially, humiliate me in plain sight, then move to erase me from the larger battle over what Grandpa had left. I placed my fork down and folded my hands in my lap, reminding myself of Grandpa's steady voice. They'll underestimate you. That's your edge. Silence wasn't surrender. It was preparation. Every insult, every humiliation was another piece of fuel I would one day set aflame. As the dinner wound down, relatives said their goodbyes, laughter softening into yawns as coats were collected. Alara stood at the doorway, hugging cousins, praising Zinnia yet again. My name was never mentioned. I slipped on my coat, walked out into the cool night, and paused at the curb, the house glowing behind me with voices fading. My jaw tightened, but my resolve was sharp. They thought they'd put me in the children's corner, I whispered to the darkness. They'll regret not knowing I was already holding the winning card. The evening after the humiliation at the children's table, I sat in my apartment with the lights low, my black dress from the funeral still hanging in the corner like a shadow that refused to leave. Every laugh, every whispered word from last night replayed itself in my head. Zinnia's smirk, my mother's approving nods, the giggles of children who thought it was funny that I was placed among them. I tried to read, to distract myself, but the words blurred. A knock at the door startled me. I wasn't expecting anyone. My heart pounded as I walked to the door and opened it. A courier stood there, holding a large envelope. "Delivery for Narina," he said. I signed quickly and shut the door. The handwriting on the front froze me in place, slanted, elegant, unmistakably Grandpa's. My throat tightened. He had been gone a week, but his script reached across that gap as if he were standing right there, steadying me once again. I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the envelope, afraid to open it, afraid of what it might say. My hands shook slightly as I traced the ink with my finger. Whatever was inside, he had prepared it before he died, knowing this day would come. The weight of that foresight settled heavy on me. Sometimes hope arrives in the smallest envelopes. I broke the seal and unfolded the letter. Grandpa's words poured off the page, sharp and clear. They will erase you, but not if you stand steady. I've left you the strength they fear. You were the only one who sat with me without asking for anything. Do not waste this gift. It is yours to protect, and it will protect you. Inside was also a reference to documents, notarized and secure, guaranteeing what he intended. Legal words mixed with his handwritten notes, his voice echoing through each phrase. Tears blurred my vision. Grief surged, but it was joined with validation, a quiet relief I hadn't felt since the funeral began. My mother and sister could spin lies, but here was truth in ink. I pressed the letter to my chest and whispered, "I won't waste it. I promise." When I reached back into the envelope, I found something else, a small leather-bound notebook, its edges worn, its pages filled with his careful handwriting. I opened it gently, scanning the entries. It wasn't a diary, it was a record of his thoughts about the family. Next to Zinnia's name, hungry for spotlight, craves applause more than love. Next to Alara, afraid of losing control, her fear will drive her decisions. And then, beside my name, steady hands. I stared at those two words until they swam in front of me, steady hands. He had seen me. He had written me into history while the others were busy trying to write me out of it. The notebook became more than paper. It was proof. Proof I wasn't invisible. Proof he knew who I was and why I mattered. Every note was a thread tying me back to him, an anchor against the storm my family was trying to whip up around me. I flipped through more pages, names, details, observations, some brutal, some gentle, all honest. Grandpa hadn't trusted them with truth, but he had trusted me with it. They tried to erase me from the board, I whispered. Grandpa wrote me back into history. I set the notebook on the table, spreading it beside the letter, both glowing under the warm kitchen light. My hands rested on the pages as I leaned forward. I imagined their faces when they saw these words, when the legal documents surfaced. I pictured Zinnia's confidence cracking, my mother's control slipping. I felt the anger in me shift, no longer burning wild, but channeling itself into strategy. Silence had worked this far. It would continue to serve me until the right moment arrived. I wasn't cornered. I was being underestimated. And there was power in that. Closing the notebook carefully, I whispered to myself, "They think I'm cornered, but corners can be strong places. You can push back from them." I placed the notebook back into the envelope, my eyes sharper now than they'd ever been. The game was far from over, but the rules had just changed. The following afternoon, I sat at my desk trying to answer a backlog of emails when my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, but I answered anyway. "Narina?" a man's voice asked. "This is Carl Jensen. I used to work with your grandfather." I remembered him vaguely from business gatherings, one of those old colleagues Grandpa still respected. "Yes, Carl. How are you?" "I'll get straight to it," he said, lowering his tone as though someone might overhear. "I've heard things. Your family is moving fast, selling properties, transferring accounts. It doesn't look right. I thought you should know." I pressed the phone tighter against my ear. "Are you sure?" "Positive," he said. "One of the properties in Beaverton is already listed. Papers have been filed. This isn't grieving, Narina. This is liquidation." When we hung up, my jaw ached from how hard I clenched it. It wasn't just disrespect anymore. It was theft in real time. My family was dismantling what Grandpa built, behind my back, as though I were too naive to notice. Betrayal isn't loud, I muttered to myself. It's paperwork signed in quiet rooms. That evening, my inbox pinged with a new message. The sender's name chilled me. Vera Hammond, the family's attorney. I hesitated before opening it, already bracing myself. The subject line read, "Medical Evaluation, Confidential." I clicked it open and scanned the attached PDF. My stomach turned. It was a so-called evaluation from a doctor I'd never heard of, dated only a week before Grandpa passed. The words leapt off the page. "Patient demonstrates diminished mental capacity, unsuitable for making major financial or legal decisions." I shoved the laptop back slightly, my chair scraping the floor. It was an outright fabrication. Grandpa had been frail, yes, but his mind had been clear enough to talk to me about history, clear enough to draft his wishes, clear enough to look me in the eye and call me steady. I dialed Vera immediately. She answered with cool detachment. "Narina." "What is this?" I snapped. "You know he wasn't incompetent." "You have your opinion," she replied smoothly. "But legally, this document calls everything into question." "You're attacking his dignity to steal his legacy," I said, my voice shaking with fury. "I'm doing my job," she said flatly. "I suggest you stop digging before you bury yourself in costs you can't afford." I ended the call with my hands trembling. American families know this tactic all too well, challenging competency, twisting grief into leverage. It wasn't just about inheritance, it was about reputation, about rewriting Grandpa himself into someone who didn't know what he wanted. "They will not tarnish his name just to steal his legacy," I whispered into the empty room. By nightfall, another knock came at my door. A courier, crisp in uniform, held out a large envelope. "Delivery for Narina Ellis," he said. I signed, shut the door, and ripped it open at the kitchen counter. Inside was a cease-desist letter. The language was sharp, threatening. "Cease immediately from making false claims regarding estate matters. Continued allegations will result in legal action, damages, and fees pursued to the fullest extent of the law." I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow in my apartment. They want me scared. They don't realize fear sharpens me. I folded the letter neatly and slid it under Grandpa's notebook, weighing lies against truth. The contrast struck me. On one side, his steady handwriting calling me steady hands. On the other, machine-printed intimidation designed to crush me. Threats are just noise, I told myself. Proof is power. The night stretched on, rain tapping against the window. I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by the envelope, Grandpa's letter, his notebook, papers that screamed lies, papers that whispered truth. I was alone, yes, but not powerless. I traced his words with my finger. Don't waste this gift. I breathed deeply, letting anger settle into something sharper, tactical patience. I would not be bullied into silence. I would not be erased. I pushed back from the table, stood, and spoke aloud into the quiet. If they want war in the shadows, I'll show them what light can do. The morning after I received the cease and desist, I sat at my kitchen table with Grandpa's notebook spread open before me. The legal letter still lay where I had left it, its sharp words glaring like a knife against the wood. I had slept little, and the silence of the apartment was heavy, but my mind was clear. I was weighing the lies against the truth, just as I had done the night before. A knock at the door startled me. For a moment, I wondered if it was another courier bringing more threats. But when I opened the door, it wasn't a stranger. It was Indira, Grandpa's lawyer. She carried a leather briefcase, her dark coat damp from the drizzle outside. "May I come in?" she asked. I nodded, stepping aside. She placed the briefcase on my table and looked me directly in the eye. "Narina, I know what they're trying to do. I've seen the so-called medical evaluation, and it's a lie. He was of sound mind. I was with him when he signed." My throat tightened. "They're trying to erase him, Indira, and me along with him." She opened the briefcase and pulled out two things, the official will and a small USB drive. She slid them across the table toward me. "This is deliberate, legal, and airtight. And this," she tapped the drive, "is a video recording of your grandfather, his voice, his signature, his words. No one can twist that." I picked up the drive, staring at its weightless size. "He thought of everything." Indira softened. "He trusted you. I promised him I'd stand by you, and I will. You're not fighting this alone." Relief flooded me like a tide breaking through stone. For the first time since the funeral, I felt validated. My suspicions weren't madness. They were truth, anchored now in legal documents and Grandpa's own voice. The briefcase between us felt like a vessel of truth against a sea of lies. Later that week, I walked to the small white house next door to Grandpa's old place. Astria, his elderly neighbor, opened the door. She was in her 70s, hair pulled back neatly, glasses perched low on her nose. When she saw me, she smiled with warmth that eased something in me. "Come in, dear," she said, ushering me inside. The scent of tea and old wood filled the air. We sat at her kitchen table, sunlight streaming through lace curtains. She patted my hand gently. "Your grandfather always spoke about you. He told me, Narina is the only one who visits, the only one who doesn't want anything from me." I blinked hard, trying to hold back tears. "He said that?" She nodded firmly. "All the time. I used to see your car in his driveway late at night, or I'd hear the two of you talking through the open window in summer. He never mentioned the others the same way." She stood and shuffled to a drawer, pulling out a small calendar. "Look," she said, pointing. In Grandpa's handwriting, notes filled the squares. Dinner with Narina. Reading with Narina. Visit. Narina brings soup. I traced the ink with trembling fingers. These weren't just memories, they were records, community testimony, the truth scribbled in the margins of ordinary days. "Thank you," I whispered. "Thank you for keeping this." Astria squeezed my hand. "Don't let them tell you otherwise. Some people live in lies, but neighbors see the truth." Her words anchored me in a way documents couldn't. A few days later, I met Ophélie, Grandpa's longtime housekeeper, at a quiet cafe downtown. She was small, gray-haired, her accent still heavy from her French roots, but her eyes were steady, She held my hands across the table before speaking. "I was there," she said firmly. "The day he signed the papers. He was clear, alert. I stood with the witnesses. He knew what he was doing." I swallowed, my eyes blurring. "Everyone says otherwise. They're making him sound confused." "No," she shook her head fiercely. "He was not confused. He told me himself, 'I trust Narina. She is the steady hand.' Those were his words." The cafe noise dimmed around me. Hearing his words echoed back by someone who had stood beside him, who had watched him write his signature, broke something in me. I let tears fall freely, unashamed. Ophélie leaned closer. "Your mother and sister will fight. They will shout. But truth does not tremble because liars shout louder. Hold steady. You must." I nodded slowly. "I will." "Thank you, Ophélie." Her testimony wasn't just support. It was a cornerstone, another piece in the wall of truth building around me. That night, back in my apartment, I laid everything out on the table. The letter Grandpa wrote, his notebook, Indira's documents, the USB drive, Astria's calendar, Ophelie's testimony written in my notes. One by one, each piece formed a chain too strong for lies to break. I sat in the center of it all, breathing deeply. For the first time since this began, I didn't feel like prey. I felt like someone preparing to act. "I wasn't alone anymore," I whispered. "Grandpa left me proof, and life left me allies." Resolve hardened in me. Silence had served its purpose. Soon, it would be time to speak. With steady hands, I plugged the USB into my laptop and clicked play. Grandpa's voice filled the room, calm, unmistakable, alive again. "Their lies won't survive his voice?" I thought, as his image appeared, steady as ever. Alara's grand living room had always been a place where appearances mattered. Tonight, the chandelier overhead cast a cold, unforgiving light on the long oak table. Relatives sat stiffly, murmuring low while they shifted in their chairs. Zinnia was already leaning forward, owning the space as though it were a stage, her hands moving dramatically as she spoke. Alara sat at the head of the table, her lips pressed in that thin line she wore whenever she wanted control without saying much. I walked in quietly, carrying only a slim folder under one arm, Grandpa's leather notebook tucked safely inside. My heels clicked against the hardwood floor, echoing in the tense silence. Every pair of eyes turned to me, some suspicious, others curious, none welcoming. Zinnia smirked, tilting her head. "You can't possibly think you belong here." I met her gaze steadily and placed the folder on the table. "Watch me." A few cousins coughed nervously. One uncle adjusted his glasses. The silence was thick, but beneath it, I felt something shift. Sometimes the quietest person in the room holds the sharpest blade. I opened my laptop and set it squarely in the center of the table. With deliberate movements, I pulled out the USB drive Indira had given me and slid it in. The screen lit up, and then his voice, Grandpa's voice, filled the room. "I leave the majority of my estate to Narina," he said, his tone calm and firm. "She is the steady hand." Gasps rippled through the room. Zinnia's color drained. Alara's eyes widened. "This isn't real," my mother stammered. "It's fabricated." "It's verified," Indira said firmly, stepping out from her seat. "The will is notarized. The recording is authentic. It stands." The murmurs grew louder. Some relatives looked shocked, others angry. But no one could deny what they had just heard. Grandpa himself declaring his intent. The sound of his voice was like he had returned, sitting with us, defending me against their lies. Yeah, it was no longer my word against theirs. It was his word, preserved in ink and video. Zinnia slammed her palm on the table. "He was confused. You manipulated him." "Really?" I asked quietly. "Because he sounded clear to me." The tension broke like glass shattering. Arguments erupted, voices overlapping. But I didn't shout. Instead, I reached into my folder and pulled out Grandpa's old fountain pen, the one he had always used, the one he left for me. Slowly, deliberately, I signed the legal documents asserting control of the estate, each stroke echoing in the silence as people realized what I was doing. When I finished, I placed the pen on top of the signed papers and looked around the room. You thought I was invisible. Turns out, I was the only one he trusted. Zinnia's chair screeched back as she stood, fists clenched. This isn't over. I met her fury with ice. For you, it just might be. The whispers in the room grew urgent, confused, but the balance of power had shifted. The documents were signed. The video was proof. The pen was a symbol. Authority now sat with me. Zinnia stormed out, her heels striking the floor like gunshots. Alara stayed seated, her hands trembling slightly, her face pale. Vera, their attorney, sat silent, lips tight, eyes darting nervously as if looking for an escape route. The others stared at me, a mixture of awe, fear, and perhaps respect. For the first time, no one dared call me unworthy. Inside, my thoughts steadied. It wasn't revenge, it was justice. And justice, when delayed, strikes harder. I gathered the documents into my folder, placed the pen gently on top, and stood. My voice was calm but firm, carrying across the room. Tomorrow, we start rebuilding. Without liars at the table. The morning after the family meeting felt different, as though the air itself carried the weight of what had been exposed. My phone buzzed incessantly on the nightstand, notifications stacking faster than I could read. Some were from relatives congratulating me quietly, as though they admired what I'd done but were too afraid to say it out loud. Others were venomous, accusing me of betrayal, of selfishness, of ruining the family. One message from a cousin read, "You should have just let it go. He wouldn't have wanted this." Another read, "Proud of you." It was about time someone stood up to them. Scrolling through them all, I felt the sharp split down the center of my family. There was no going back. I set the phone down, screen glowing with the chaos of a broken network of relatives. Truth doesn't heal families, I whispered to myself. It exposes them. And once exposed, people scatter to protect themselves. With a long breath, I turned the phone face down. I couldn't fight every rumor, couldn't spend my days explaining myself to people who had already chosen what they wanted to believe. Victory felt real, but so did the loneliness that followed. By mid-afternoon, I heard a knock at my door. When I opened it, my mother stood there. Elara's face looked pale, her posture less rigid than usual. For the first time in years, she seemed smaller, diminished somehow. "Narina," she said softly, "we need to talk." I stepped aside, and she walked into the living room. Her hands fidgeted with the ends of her scarf as she sat down. "You've ruined this family," she began, her voice trembling. "Do you think he'd be proud of you? Proud that you tore us apart?" I sat opposite her, calm. "He'd be proud that I didn't let you erase me. Or him." Her lips parted as though to respond, but nothing came out. I saw it in her eyes, something close to regret, maybe even an apology. But it stopped short, strangled by pride. She looked down, shook her head, and rose abruptly. "I can't," she muttered, her voice breaking, and moved toward the door. Her scarf slipped from her shoulders, falling onto the arm of the chair she had sat in. She didn't notice. Or maybe she did, and chose to leave it behind, a silent reminder of her presence even after she stormed out. I stared at it for a long moment, realizing she wasn't a villain in her own mind. She was simply a woman afraid of losing control, and fear had made her cruel. The days that followed brought another storm, this time not in living rooms but online. Zinnia took to social media with a carefully staged photo of herself, captioned with words dripping in victimhood. It's hard when someone you love manipulates the weakest moments of a dying man. Some of us were there for him, others, only for themselves. The comments rolled in. Some defended her, praising her as the dutiful granddaughter, but others weren't so kind. "Funny," one commenter wrote, "I never saw you there in the hospital." Another chimed in, "Your sister was the only one people ever saw visiting." For every voice siding with her, there was another dismantling her story. I didn't respond, I didn't post, didn't comment, didn't argue. Arguing with liars doesn't make you truthful, I told myself. It makes you loud, and loudness is their game, not mine. Zinnia grew louder as the week went on, posting stories, reposting comments that favored her, crafting her narrative. But silence, steady and patient, was working against her. The more she shouted, the more credibility she lost. Truth doesn't sprint, it endures. And then, one evening, I walked through Grandpa's old house, my house now, legally and fully mine. The silence there was different. It wasn't loneliness, it was peace. I moved through the study, placing his leather notebook back on his desk. Beside it, I set the fountain pen he had left for me, the same one I'd used to sign the takeover papers. I stood for a moment, staring at them. Two simple objects, yet together they represented something more than victory. They represented endurance. I thought I wanted their apology, I said quietly to the empty room. But what I needed was my own strength. The realization settled deep inside me. I didn't need reconciliation. I didn't need them to see me or to admit they were wrong. My independence was the victory. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I locked the house and paused on the porch. The evening was cool, the world around me steady, calm. I whispered into the stillness. They wanted me erased. Instead, I became the author of this story. A week had passed since the family meeting that tore every mask away. The fallout spread faster than fire on dry brush. At the grocery store, I caught the way people glanced at me, then whispered. At church, I saw how heads bent together after services, their voices lowered but their eyes unmistakably fixed on Alara and Zinnia. It wasn't just whispers. Business associates of Grandpa's distanced themselves from my mother, one even telling me bluntly, "Your sister and mother. People are saying they tried to gut the estate before the body was cold." The words stung, not because they were lies, but because they were true. The irony was sharp. For years, I was the invisible one. Now, they were the ones unable to step outside without reputations shadowed by greed. I didn't celebrate. No champagne, no smug declarations. Instead, I walked quietly through the neighborhood, listening to the hum of conversation, knowing justice was working on its own. Reputation is a currency. And theirs had just been bankrupted. A few days later, they demanded one last meeting at the estate. Alara called me, her tone brittle but desperate. "We can't end like this. We need to talk." When they arrived, both she and Zinnia looked thinner, worn down by the constant eyes on them. They entered Grandpa's study with restless energy, pacing like caged animals. "You'll ruin everything he built if you cut us out," Alara snapped. "The estate needs us," Zinnia added, her voice sharp. "You think you can carry his legacy alone? Without us, it falls apart." I sat at the desk, Grandpa's notebook before me. My voice was steady. "He trusted me, not you. This was his choice, and I will honor it." They both scoffed, ready to argue further, until I opened the notebook and began to read aloud. "Zinnia," I read, "hungry for spotlight, craves applause more than love." She froze. "Alara," I continued, "afraid of losing control. Her fear will drive her decisions." Their faces drained of color as each word fell like a gavel. I closed the notebook gently and looked at them. This isn't my judgment. This was his. The silence that followed was thick, final. There was nothing left for them to fight with. The next day, I finalized everything. Sitting in Indira's office, I signed the last legal documents that cemented my full control of the estate. Zinnia's access to accounts was frozen. Ilara's attempt to quietly sell property was stopped cold. When Vera, their lawyer, tried to protest, I dismissed her. Calmly. Firmly. "You no longer represent this family's interests," I told her. "Indira does." Indira slid the stack of papers across the desk. I picked up Grandpa's old fountain pen, the same one I'd used at the family meeting, and signed with deliberate strokes. When I finished, I set the pen down on top of the contracts. "They tried to buy me off with scraps," I murmured, and I answered with the signature that sealed their fate. The satisfaction wasn't loud, it was steady, dignified, complete. Later, I walked alone through Grandpa's house. The rooms were quiet now, filled with memory rather than conflict. In the study, I placed the letter and the notebook in a glass case, a small memorial just for me. They wanted revenge, I said softly. I wanted justice. And justice doesn't shout. It endures. I locked the front door for the night, pausing to press my hand against the wood one last time. Rest easy, Grandpa, I whispered. I kept my promise. As I stepped off the porch, the evening air wrapped around me. Cool, still, timeless. I felt the weight of everything that had passed and the strength that remained. The story wasn't about the millions, it was about the silence that turned into thunder.